Welcome, brave souls, to the chilling depths of horror and detail, the realm where the shadows whisper ancient secrets and nightmares come to life. I am your guide through the darkness, and on this channel, we delve into the spine-chilling world of werewolf horror stories that will send shivers down your spine. First story, The Dogman. This story takes place in 2007, when I was a 9-year-old kid. I live in Michigan, and it was the summer before I started 3rd grade. It was a tradition for my dad and I to go up north and stay a weekend visiting his buddy who had a cabin on the lake, and this year was no different. I was excited as I always was, but this time I was particularly happy that my dad's wife and her kids weren't going to be with us. The driveway to the cabin was a long dirt road, with a smaller cabin and fireplace near the front. It's also surrounded by a thick woods that stretches along both sides of the driveway, which extends about 100 yards until it opens up into the spot where people park their cars. Just beyond the cars was the bunkhouse, and beyond the bunkhouse was the front yard to the cabin. As we pulled in, my father reminded us that we would have to camp out in the front yard and sleep in a tent together because the bunkhouse was already being occupied by his friend's kids. I didn't mind at all, as the sounds of nature helped me fall asleep. The sun was setting as we unloaded the truck, and the leaves swayed with the breeze. The branches danced and cast shadows along the yard that occasionally changed when the sun dipped behind the clouds. The entire property was surrounded by woods and enclosed within a chain-link fence, with the front yard having a gate that opened up onto the deck. Once you were on the deck, there was a table and grill to your left and a doorway to the cabin on your right. If you kept going, you'd go down 4 steps and come across the hot tub on the left and another doorway on the right, followed by the rickety wooden stairway that led down to the lake. After we said hi to everyone, my dad and I started pitching our tent. I glanced to the right and noticed there was a small clearing about 50 yards out in the woods. I didn't pay much attention to it, and we finished setting up the tent in no time. We then proceeded to join everyone for dinner on the deck, followed by a fire down by the lake. After a few hours of making s'mores, listening to everyone tell ghost stories, and watching some fireworks that were set off on the dock, I found myself exhausted from the trip and started saying good night to everyone. I gave my dad a hug goodnight and started heading up to the deck and out to the front yard. I unzipped the tent, crawled into my sleeping bag, and passed out. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but I could hear my dad snoring lightly next to me, so I assumed it was well into the night. One thing I picked up on right away was that it was dead quiet outside. Instead of hearing the normal summer sounds that I'm used to hearing at night, there was nothing. There were no crickets chirping, no owls hooting, not even the rustling of the leaves or twigs rustling as the nocturnal creatures came out for food. It was dead silent. I felt extremely uneasy, but I also realized why I had woken up. I had to pee. I slowly crawled to the front of the tent and reached for the zipper, hesitating for a moment before unzipping the door. I poked my head out and was met with the eeriest silence I've ever heard. The moon was full and illuminated the trees and their branches as they sat above me silently. The sky was clear and the stars twinkled as they danced in the darkness. I slowly stepped out of the tent and felt the morning dew from the grass hit the bottom of my feet. I glanced up at the sky, just in awe at how clear it was. We never got to see the stars this bright back in the city, and I liked to cherish the moments when I could. I walked over to the big oak tree that was just inside the fence and started doing my business. I lowered my head to the clearing in front of me, and that's when I heard it. Ooh. The sound pierced through the silent night. Chills ran down my spine and I froze in place as my head darted in the direction of the woods, trying to locate the source of the sound. Ooh. It happened again. This time it was echoed by a few more. What followed were the familiar yips of coyotes. and I was relieved when I saw them emerge from one side of the clearing and exit into the other. I stood there quietly as I observed the canines running and jumping through the clearing. When the last of them had disappeared, I tapped out the last of my business and glanced down to zip up my shorts. When I looked back up, I saw something I will never forget. There, in the clearing 50 yards away, was what looked like a coyote mixed with a human, and it was standing on its hind legs, looking right at me. It had pointy ears, thick dark fur, a snout that was snarling and revealing a set of wicked teeth, and its eyes were yellow-orange, staring straight into mine. The thing that terrified me most about this thing was its size. If I had to guess, it had to have stood around 8 feet tall. I was frozen stiff, but that quickly changed when the thing looked up and let out the most horrific scream I've ever heard. Nothing about it sounded human. I tripped backwards over my feet and dashed back into the tent, zipping it shut and diving under my sleeping bag. I then heard the grunt of a large animal, followed by the rattling of the chain-link fence, and then the unmistakable sound of feet hitting the earth. I closed my eyes shut tight and hoped to God this thing would go away. I laid there, trembling in my sleeping bag as I heard a set of 2 feet slowly stomp around our tent. After a few minutes, I pulled my sleeping bag slightly down below my eyes, and I saw its shadow in front of the tent. Its pointy ears tilted back as it let out another scream, before running towards the driveway of the cabin and disappearing into the night. I laid there in my sleeping bag, paralyzed by fear, hoping it wouldn't come back. After what seemed like forever, the sun finally came up. I asked my dad if he heard the screams last night and told him about what I saw, but he assured me it was just a nightmare and that no such thing existed. I dropped it shortly after and kept this story mostly to myself until now. I don't know what it was for sure that I saw that night, but I did see it. And I do know this: I will never set foot near the Michigan woods alone at night ever again. Second story. Does anyone know Bibbet? These things might be confabulation. My brain is turning to mush, and maybe for good reason. Maybe in trying to forget, I accidentally remembered. Alcohol is a hell of a drug, and the Ocala National Forest was a hell of a place to grow up. You see, from just north of Orlando well into Gainesville and all the way to Daytona Beach, there is a pine barren that is not often talked about, and maybe for good reason. Point to any given point on the map in central Florida between those 3 cities, and you will more than likely be pointing at a clay road with a distinguished name like 498. A road that smells inexplicably like bonfires and rotting fish, where the sun is blotted out by ancient pine trees. A road that sees a total of 5 trucks every 2 days. Yes, alcohol is a hell of a drug. I got far away from central Florida as soon as I could and drowned myself in the world's most culinary drug. Doesn't matter where I went or why, I will probably have to go back soon. Maybe that's why I'm remembering all of this now. Maybe it doesn't matter at all. My dad had a friend named Bibbet. I would say it was a rule in our house that we never talked about Bibbet, but we lived in a trailer. So it was a rule in our trailer that we never talked about Bibbet. Bibbet was a frog of a man, older than my grandpa, but jumpy like a little kid. Maybe it was meth. It surely wasn't unheard of in that place or time. What I remember is him asking me to think hard about the werewolf problem. Every day it was the werewolf problem with Bibbet. Hitler was easier on the final solution than Bibbet was on the werewolf problem. I'm sure that I have memories of Bibbet where he wasn't begging me to solve the werewolf problem, but they are few and far between. This memory sticks with me. He finally sat me down intensely and asked, "Jim, have you come to a conclusion about the werewolf problem?" In that moment, like eons of children sat before adults asking penetrating questions before me, I wilted. I had no answer to the werewolf problem. He looked at me, dejected. He picked up a handful of pine needles and stuck them in his mouth. Wistfully, he told me I'd doomed us all. It would make sense if I said that the troubles came after that during the full moon. But that wasn't the case. The troubles came extremely irregularly. Bibet would come over. He would help himself to a gallon or two of our milk, and then the howling would start for 3 nights. Always 3 nights. My dad would post up on a mound of sugar sand with a mossy oak rifle, listening to a Roy D. Mercer tape on repeat, chewing tobacco and staring into the woods. If I asked him what he was doing, he would look at me with hate in his eyes and say, "Solving the problem you couldn't." I never really put those things together until now, especially since things in the forest could get weird. You eventually learn not to ask questions, but I do now wonder if Bibet and the howlings were connected somehow. Maybe not. My parents eventually managed to save enough money to buy a house on the land the trailer was on. This only led to more problems. The howling stopped, sure, but suddenly there was more wildlife coming out of the woods. On 2 different occasions, a Florida cougar wandered up to our door and tried to scratch its way in. Between that and the naked forest men occasionally pounding on the door for refuge, I quickly learned that only threats came from the forest. Bibet died in a house fire, apparently. I was tripping on acid when my dad called and said that. He seemed almost giddy. Maybe that was my imagination, as I was surely trying to get off the phone as fast as possible. You always try to get off the phone as fast as possible when you are on the phone with your parents on acid. But it has always stayed with me. How happy my dad seemed telling me about how Bibet was trapped in his trailer, burning alive with his collection of parakeets and boas. See, I've never had a bad trip on psychedelics, but I'm one of the unlucky few that simply can't handle cannabis. And I think I have a reason why. I had a friend that was living with me and my parents shortly after high school who had nowhere else to go. One day, the 2 of us were walking through the forest. A few days before, we had seen an abandoned Chiquita banana truck overgrown with vines and stinging nettles. We were about to go in when we were both suddenly overwhelmed with a sense of dread. We both started crying and laughing and ran away, as children often do. This next time, we brought with us Captain Morgan's spiced rum and a blunt. We were determined to blunt our emotions and get into the truck one way or another. I didn't smoke much at the time, but my friend was a bit of a pothead. As we followed the river deeper into the forest, I remember being enamored with the way the dragonflies swarmed around his one-hitter. We must have crossed 6 barbed wire fences belonging to no one when we finally arrived back at the truck. As I moved to go inside, my friend lit the blunt and said, "Wait, this is a cleansing of the wicked." I sighed and took a hit, because my weirdly superstitious pothead friend wouldn't let me move forward without it. Suddenly, I remembered Bibet. I remembered the werewolf problem. Maybe I was just high. That's what I told myself. Sometimes we'd made me shaky and think dumb things. So I laughed and asked my friend if he knew about the werewolf problem. I have never seen someone's eyes go so ice cold. "Bibet," he croaked. I felt tears come into my eyes. "You know Bibet?" He didn't respond. I don't want to answer yes or no, but I think that banana truck is bad news. So, that led to about an hour of panic, running through the woods. We ended up at a horse riding school that I was completely unaware existed. I asked a woman that worked there if she knew the way to County Road on where my parents lived, and she acted like I was out of my mind. I guess that's how far we had somehow wandered into the forest. Or maybe that's just how high I looked. Either way, it took 3 hours walking through deep brush and thorns to get back to my house. After that day, my friend never talked about Bibet. He would get violently angry when I brought him up, saying things like, "Fuck man, I don't know what a bibbit is. Shut the fuck up. After that day, my friends all went on to be successful potheads, while I descended into alcoholism. You know how it goes. I smoke weed. I see Bibbet. Even if I hold it together in the moment, I dream of him, howling, banging on my window, telling me I could have easily solved the problem. Years later, that same friend told me that a faceless man had chased him in that same forest. He had been walking along, seen a figure, and decided to flick at the bird. My friend was kind of stupid, in case that wasn't clear by now. The creature turned around, and he described it as a 7-foot humanoid creature with skin and a face exactly the texture and color of blank paper, which then went on to chase him for a solid 30 seconds. Like I said, things got weird in the forest. So now I'm thousands of miles away, shaking, fearing the day I have to return to the Ocala National Forest. Does anyone here know Bibbet? Third story. The Monster of Fallaston, Alberta. My whole childhood, I grew up in the city of Toronto. I'm a born and raised city rat, and I am totally accustomed and comfortable with the big city life. I lived in an apartment downtown. It was just me and my mom. She did such a great job of raising me and taking care of me. I always understood that being a single parent is hard. However, it was really tough for my mom. She had to get 2 jobs, and she even worked nights once a month or so. She was from a very small place in western Alberta called Fallaston. It was a farm community with only about 100 residents total. And so to move all the way across the country to Toronto, Ontario was a huge step for her. I think the most common phrase I heard when I was younger was, "Oh, this is not how we used to do things in Fallaston." She had to adjust to the city life quickly, and she had me when she was young, too. She was just 20 years old when I was born. It was an uphill battle, but I'm pretty good at being self-sufficient and doing my part. I would always ask my mom why we didn't live in Fallaston anymore if she missed it so much, and it was always a dodgy subject. When I was a teenager, I was determined to hear about her hometown, and I guess she decided I was old enough to hear her story. One morning, after she had a night shift, I asked her again. That's when she told me about her life in Fallaston and why she didn't want me to grow up there. The following is in her words about the Monster of Fallaston, Alberta. Fallaston was a really small place. Families were a bit big because everybody had a farm and you needed the bodies around the house to take care of the land. I couldn't tell you how many people lived there, but there were about 25 to 30 farms spread out over Fallaston, so probably over 100 people total. The road in lead to the bottom of the horseshoe of Fallaston. Sorry, I should clarify, the horseshoe is what the road was called, shaped like a big horseshoe if you looked at it from a map or from above it. The road into the town connected to the bottom middle of the horseshoe, with the 2 ends atop it leading to the Fallaston thicket. The thicket was a really large forested area full of wildlife and overgrowth. The farms lined either side of the road as it curved either side, with our main town hall at the bottom of the horseshoe. Anyways, from the time I was born, it was common knowledge that when it started getting dark on the night of a full moon, you were to ensure that all the animals were locked away in the barn. If something was left outside, it wouldn't be alive in the morning. I had never seen it when I was younger, but you know how gossip goes. From what I gathered, the monster looked like a man because it could walk on 2 legs, but it would run on all 4s and it was covered in dark, thick fur. I knew it was big, and it had a face like a wolf, big mouth, teeth, and angry animal eyes. That was what Dave Sanders told us, at least. He said his dad chased the monster off the property and that he had seen the monster, but my dad told me that the Sanders had lost a lot of animals that year. So I'm not sure if Dave was telling us the truth when he said his dad chased it away successfully. Anyway, we kept to ourselves. It was a practice in discipline. If you forgot to do your diligence and take care of your animals, you pay the price for it. Full moons come once a month, and you just have to deal with it when it comes. We were fine with that. But Philip was a different story. I was seeing your father at the time. Mark and I had been together for a couple years, and I was definitely in love. His best friend was Philip Grant, and my best friend was Emily Smithers. Just by being around us so much, Philip and Emily eventually started going out too. So the four of us spent a lot of time with each other when we didn't have to help out around our land. There was an incident, however. It happened in the spring. I think it was May, but it could have been April. I don't know the circumstances, other than that Philip was supposed to close up the barn in preparation for the monster, and he didn't. The times when the monster would strike, it would be because a lone animal got left out, or a couple escaped. Generally, our town was pretty diligent at ensuring we didn't give the monster anything to take from us. But Philip just screwed up. The morning after a full moon, Simon Grant went to open up the barn, but found it open. Their whole barn looked like a slaughterhouse. Everything was completely devoured, save for some bones and some blood. The whole town pitched in to help out the Grants, and they got some more animals, but it was a huge hit to their family. Philip was severely punished by his father, so the gossip went. From that day onward, Philip made it his goal to kill the monster of Falliston. It was all he talked about. He started drawing, plotting, and planning, trying to convince Mark to come out and help him. I was obviously opposed. This went on for months. I think part of it was to outlet the frustration from whatever his dad did to him, because he was a totally different person after that incident. Emily was very supportive of him, despite worrying for his well-being. I don't blame her. It would have been nice to not have the monster to worry about. Philip's obsession culminated in June, but it didn't seem that way at first. He hadn't spoken a breath about the monster in almost a week. Mark, Emily, and I silently hoped it was because he had moved on. It was a Saturday, and it was a rare occasion when we were all free at night. There was a big community event going on in Town Hall at the bottom of the Horseshoe. Mark, Emily, Philip, and I made plans to hang out at Philip's house, but last minute, Mark told me he wasn't going to be able to make it, so I went over with Emily. It was a full moon, however, so all of our families made sure that we were to be indoors before sunset. When we got there, we hung out in his living room, which faced the fields behind the Grant household. Philip was acting like himself for a little while, but he started getting fidgety as it got darker out. I couldn't tell if Emily noticed, but I had a bad feeling build up inside me. That was when I brought it up. I remember saying to him, "Philip, what's going on? Why do you keep looking outside?" I looked out over his shoulder and noticed something. One of the Wells family's chickens that they had given to Philip's family was outside. The barn was locked up. Then, I noticed the rifle leaning by the back door. He was trying to lure the monster. I remember I pleaded with him to not do this, and that it was too dangerous. Emily looked shocked and quickly grew frightened. "Philip, it's a bad idea. I'm not going to let you do this. Don't tell me what to do. This is for the best. Think of all the good a single, well-placed bullet can do." I begged him not to do something stupid and wished Mark was with me to stop him. Emily sat silently, too afraid to defend him, but too loyal to say something. As he explained his reasoning to us, a horrible sound from outside sprung Philip into action. I looked out the window and I felt my heart in my throat. The chicken frantically ran around and made horrible sounds as I saw the monster come closer to the pen, becoming further illuminated by the porch light the closer it got. It was covered in thick, gray fur and had a head like a wolf or some sort of hunting dog. Long, pointed ears, a dog-like snout riddled with large fangs and piercing yellow eyes. It was incredibly humanoid in its appearance and was covered in muscle. It was on all fours, but it was definitely at least 7 feet tall standing. It stalked close to the chicken like a large jungle cat, which was almost funny. A beast that big looked like it could swallow the small bird whole. It wasn't funny, though, because the Grant's living room window was the only thing between the monster and Emily and I. I watched in fascination as it broke its hunting ritual and savagely pounced on the chicken, devouring it in seconds. Then, I heard it. A gunshot rang out. The monster's ear peaked up as it took an aggressive stance, as it began to stand on its hind legs. Seeing Philip with the gun frantically reloading after he missed his first shot, I thought I was about to watch my friend die. However, it did something unexpected. It turned and sprinted away on all fours. I heard Philip yell in anger as he finished reloading and sprinted after the monster. I wish I could say I ran after him and stopped him, but I didn't. Emily and I sat in the silence for a few moments before she broke and started to cry. Moments later, we heard another distant gunshot, and our eyes shot to the window. Outside of the small illuminated area from the porch light, we saw nothing but darkness. Somehow, we fell asleep on the couch. When I woke up, it was bright outside. Emily was still asleep, and as I looked around, I audibly gasped when I saw Philip sitting at the kitchen table. He looked shell-shocked and very upset. A million things went through my mind. Was he hurt? When did he get home? Where did he go? But instinctively, the first thing I asked him was, "Did you kill it?" Without looking up to meet my gaze, he shook his head.
No.
I cornered it near the thicket. The thing was on its hind legs, I guess trying to intimidate me, but it didn't attack. It just looked at me, and I shot him point blank, right in the chest. Philip stood up, meeting my gaze as he walked over, and crumpling up a newspaper page as he did. He tossed it at me, and I failed to react, the paper ball harmlessly bouncing off my forehead. "I might as well have done that," he continued. "I got so spooked. I just froze up and waited to die. But it just ran past me. Off into the thicket," he finished. I shook my head in shock. "I think it's going to get a lot worse around Falliston before it gets better," Philip said as he looked at me with sad eyes, glancing down at the still sleeping Emily. After a moment of silence, he cleared his throat and spoke again. "I think you should go. Don't tell anybody about this." I nodded as I got up to leave. As I opened his front door, Philip spoke again. "It speaks, you know." I left. Philip's words rang true over the next year. It was getting a whole lot worse in Falliston. Every moon cycle, the incidents with the monster increased. It started lurking around farms. It somehow would break into barns, and it was being seen all over Falliston. It's a very big area because farms take up a huge amount of space, and the distance between homes is very large. So the fact that it was being sighted in multiple areas of the region in a single night was alarming. It was big, strong, and fast, and using all of its attributes. The town was getting worried. On top of the issues everybody was having with the supernatural, the friend group was suffering. Philip started resenting Mark, which was horrifying to me to see two best friends fall out. Philip was angry. He would say that if Mark had been with us the night in June, it would have gone differently. Mark was tired of Philip's obsession with the monster and wanted Philip to realize that his actions were irrational and dangerous. The two stopped wanting to be around each other. When they were, it would be time filled with animosity and in the air and vitriol in their words. Almost a full year since the incident with Philip in the spring, the word spread that there was to be a town meeting at the bottom of the horseshoe. My family took me down with them, and I saw that Mark, Emily, and Philip were there already with their families. The families began discussing the ramifications of allowing the monster to continue wreaking havoc in Falliston. They discussed how the houses were being stalked now. It was clear the monster was beginning to want for the taste of human flesh. I remember Simon Grant piped in and made the conclusion that the monster was getting hungrier. It would stop setting for farm animals sooner rather than later. Eventually, it was decided. The monster had to die. I felt uneasy, remembering how Philip failed to rid our world of it almost a year ago. What hope would we have? As my uneasiness grew and I yearned to speak my thoughts about the futility of trying to kill the monster, Philip spoke up from the back of the crowd, and people parted to see the young man speaking. "We'll kill it. Me and Mark. The full moon comes in a week. We all know it has to live in the thicket. So we'll go in. We'll find it and kill it." To my horror, everybody agreed with the idea, and it was settled. Philip and Mark were going to go into the Fallaston thicket and kill the monster. When the day came, I was nervous. I knew something was afoot, and it was going to end badly in some way. I was with Mark at my house in the hours of the late afternoon leading up to sunset as Mark packed his gun and knives and donned thick clothes. My fears grew when he looked up at me and sighed. He wanted to say something, but he was holding it back. "What is it?" "Philip, he's going to try to kill me tonight." "What are you talking about?" I felt a shiver throughout my body as fear began to overcome me at hearing his words. He hasn't talked to me in months, and the last time we did was hardly friendly. Then, he volunteers the both of us to go into the thicket after dark? He blames me for his experience the night he tried to be a hero, and he's been blaming himself watching the monster terrorize Fallaston. He's going to rationalize his fears. He's going to try to kill me. Don't go. Let's talk to him. Sit him down. Just figure this out.
No, Sarah.
We have to be there tonight. Whatever is going to happen is going to happen. Mark spoke with a voice completely void of remorse or emotion. He looked at me with an empty, resigned stare as he finished packing his guns and left without saying goodbye. I immediately called Emily. We were on our way to the thicket before I knew it. Emily had her dad's gun. The plan was to show the guys that we wouldn't let them solve their problems with a medieval-age solution. The thicket had a path that went through the west end all the way through to the east end, but it was massive and there were lots of woods surrounding the meager pathway. We entered through the west pathway as the sun was creeping down over the horizon. The sky was a vibrant purple as we entered, but the thick canopy of trees and brush limited vision of anything outside the thicket. Emily looked purely horrified, jumping at every chipmunk that stirred or bird that moved. I watched the pistol shake in her hands as they held it with white knuckles. I hoped for her sake she wouldn't have to hold it up or use it. The fear was evident, and even having the gun wasn't helping. I didn't blame her. This was where the monster made its home. I was just more worried about Mark and Philip. After minutes of walking, we heard the shouting. We picked up our pace from a fast walk to a jog and cut off the trail to follow the sounds. Soon enough, we were met with a large slope down to a slight clearing in the thicket, where Mark stood in a defenseless stance, Philip holding his rifle only 10 feet in front of Mark. They didn't see us. My heartbeat quickened to a race as I realized the gravity of the situation, and I almost prayed for the monster to show itself. "Shut up, Mark. Fuck you. You wouldn't be in this mess if you hadn't laid a stupid fucking trap. Why couldn't you just leave it alone?" "Shut up, Mark. No. You had to be the hero because you originally fucked up by leaving the barn open? Don't you see how everything you do makes things worse? Why do you think this will change that trend?" Philip lowered his voice. "You aren't going to change my mind. You're running out of time, Phil." Mark sounded too confident for a man seconds from death. Philip tightened up his stance and held the gun higher, taking a step forward. As he did, Emily screamed and snapped me out of the trance the situation had put me in. As she did, Philip was startled and fired the gun, but missed. Mark immediately looked over and shot us an angry look, and just as quickly, ran at Philip and tackled him. Somehow, Philip got to his feet and ran as Mark chased him through the woods. Emily and I quickly descended the hill, but Emily did so much faster as she ran in the direction that Mark and Philip went. We weaved in and out of trees and thick brush, which was getting harder and harder by the second. The little light from the sunset that creeped into the thicket was gone, as the moon began to replace the sun in the sky, and darkness replaced the light. As I rounded the last bend, panting and breathless, I saw Emily had stopped in her tracks. I rested behind her as I followed her gaze. I didn't see Mark anywhere. Philip was hunched over on the ground, but he wasn't Philip. Even from the distance I heard the horrible sounds of bones creaking and shifting as I looked at the horrible combination of man and beast crumpled on the ground in front of me like a contortionist. Silver hair covered his arms and face and thickened by the second. His head was contorted and disgusting as it changed shape and form in front of my eyes. His horrifying screams of agony as his human body distorted and warped slowly became growls and snarls. Before I knew it, I watched the color drain from its eyes, and I felt the humanity drain from its body. It rose, uncurling himself of the ground and rising to 2 legs. This was smaller than the monster I had seen Philip encounter the first night. The fur was lighter, the eyes less yellow. Even still, it was horrible and magnificent all at once. It looked at us, at Emily holding the gun with shaking grasp in front of her, and I watched its chest rise and fall once before opening its mouth. The words were choked out, every syllable an effort to get out. I heard the strained and yet very clear voice of something not human, something that was not natural.
I'm sorry.
Emily used a free hand to cover her mouth as she squinted her eyes, holding back tears while she held the gun shakily in her other. Slowly, I saw something moving closer to us from over the shoulder of the new beast. In what seemed like an instant, the original monster had sprung from the brush like a predatory jungle cat and sunk its claws into the thing we had seen Philip turn into. The monster was bigger, faster, stronger, and had the element of surprise. It was no contest. I watched it lean forward and bite into the other's throat, and with that, I watched Philip Grant die as a beast. Emily dropped the gun, hyperventilating as she cried at the scene. She was unable to contain herself. The noise of the gun hitting the forest floor was the first sound made by either of us following the monster's horrific battle. The second the steel barrel touched the brush at Emily's feet, the monster's gaze shot up to meet Emily's. I made a bad decision. Maybe it was good for me at the time, but I feel bad about it to this day. I lived. I got out of the thicket. I left Emily Phillips behind. She was devoured. It was the last I ever saw of her. Your dad told me the next day that when he had run after Philip, he realized it hadn't been worth it and doubled back to find us, but couldn't. I actually ran into him when I escaped the thicket, and he embraced me happily to know I was okay. We left the thicket together as your dad consoled me following the trauma. The next little while was a rush. A lot happened very quickly in Falliston. Mark and I told the people that the monster had killed Philip and Emily, and that we had escaped. We did not tell them that Philip had become a monster himself. I was filled with regret about the events of the evening. Emily had been my best friend. I felt responsible. The town was not going to let the monster continue to run rampant after 2 people had lost their lives, however. I heard from my dad that at the next full moon, the townspeople were going to burn down the thicket and hopefully trap the monster in the blaze. I also found out that I was pregnant. I didn't want a child to be born in Fallaston. It wouldn't have been a good life. I wouldn't have been able to live with myself knowing that I was in a town where my two best friends had died, where the townsfolk burned down the thicket to kill a supernatural monster that had terrorized us. Secretly, I was mostly afraid that when they tried to burn down the thicket, it would fail and the monster would wreak havoc. I left 2 days before the next full moon cycle. I told your dad to come with me, but he had become very sick. I didn't know the specifics. It had something to do with bad meat. He told me he would come with me when he got better. I ended up in Toronto. I waited. Unfortunately, he was too sick. He never got better. I had said my final goodbye to your dad when I left Fallaston. I had heard as well that the plan had worked. The townspeople found the monster's burnt body near the entrance to the eastern end of the thicket shortly after the blaze had died down. Fallaston was finally free from the monster. When my mom had finished telling me the story, I was horrified but fascinated. However, any questions I asked would be dismissed. I never got straight answers out of her. I never got to meet or even talk to her parents or my dad's parents. I've asked a few times to visit Fallaston, and I've been told that we are never going to go back there, that the memories are too much for her to handle. Recently, I asked her one last question about Fallaston, about her story. She was sitting in the living room, unwinding after her day with a glass of wine. Mom, yes, sweetie? Your story about Fallaston? Sam, not tonight. It's just one question, about when you were in the thicket. She let out a long sigh and hesitantly agreed to let me ask my question. When the monster looked up at you and Emily, how did you get away? What do you mean? It was bigger, stronger, and faster than anything human could be. You were deep in the woods. You said Emily got devoured. How did you escape? She looked at me and took a breath. I told you. I ran. I don't know. I never looked back. That's why I feel bad. I took in her response and let the subject drop. I'm going to start paying attention to the specifics of the days when my mom tells me she is going to be working a night shift. Fourth story. Here's why you must never attempt to rescue a dog. I found him halfway through my daily morning run. I had traversed the winding jogging track as it cut through the wooded portion of the park before making its way to the top of a little hillock, slicing it into 2 clean halves. It was at this little summit that I first heard it. This soft, barely audible whining coming from somewhere beneath the hulking oak tree to my right. I stopped and took a moment to catch my breath, which escaped out of my mouth as little puffs of steam, making me feel like an overworked smokestack. He was peeking at me through a tiny gap in the unkempt grass that he was using like a shield, as soft rays of the early morning sun fought their way through the thick cloud cover and fell on his large brown head. I quickly scanned the surroundings and saw that there wasn't anyone else anywhere nearby. What in the world was this little pupper doing here? Had he been abandoned? Was he lost? He didn't seem to be wearing a collar. He gazed up at me almost longingly, so I decided to investigate. Barking softly, his tail began to wag as I trotted over to him. But maybe I got a little too close, too quickly, because he suddenly threw up his tail up like a battle standard and growled. Mixed signals, huh? It was possible that whoever had left him here had also abused him. That would be a likely, if heartbreaking explanation of his odd behavior. I decided to respect his boundaries and retreated to a distance I thought would make him feel safe. Hey there, buddy, I said, in a voice as sweet as saccharine. What are you doing here all alone? He cocked his head to the right and began looking at me in amazement with these strange, almost human-like eyes. I snapped my fingers in rapid succession and whistled tenderly, letting him know I posed no threat to him. He howled delightfully as his bushy tail began sweeping the air once again. I patted my thighs. "Come here, boy."
Come.
He sprinted towards me, trampling the grass with astonishingly long strides, startling me with his speed. I thought he was going to bowl me over, but he ground to a halt right outside of my reach, licking his lips and wagging his tail nervously. I instinctively bent towards him, but stopped when he looked warily at me. Better be safe here, and let him take the lead. He hesitated, but began slowly approaching me, his nose buried in the ground, sucking up all the interesting smells as he kept watching me from the corner of his eyes. Cautious, but hopeful, his whole backside started jerking left-right as his nostrils reached my shoes, and he howled in elation before licking away at my shins. He then jumped up, standing on his hind legs as he put his front paws on my waist for support, his tail turning into a blur. I crinkled my nose as he blew air in my face. His breath was rank, like a rotting corpse. Ugh, why did it smell so bad? Was he sick? Is that why he was abandoned? I fought through the repulsion, brought my hand down to his head, and began petting him. He really liked that, and showed as much to me by rubbing himself against my legs. He then backed up and jumped at me again, playfully biting at my fingers. I threw my hands up in the air, far out of his reach, so he went down and started nipping at my shoelaces. Fuck, he was really energetic, hopping from one place to another, running circles around me, barking, whining, biting, scratching, just an endless bundle of energy. If I'm being honest, it was getting to be a little bit much. His bites and scratches were starting to hurt, though he hadn't broken my skin yet. Thankfully, it was when he caught my pants between his teeth and began shaking his head furiously that I decided to speak up. "Stop. That's enough," I said gently, but firmly. "Stop it." He looked up at me questioningly, the fabric of my pants still tangled up in his mouth. "Drop it," I said. He didn't listen and continued to bite at my leg, his teeth digging into the flesh. I decided to be a bit more stern.
No.
He froze, and I could feel his whole body tense up. He came at me again, trying to bite my knees, so I said no again, much louder this time. He reacted by baring his teeth at me aggressively as the hairs on his back stood up. It was a shocking change, going from playful to such violent behavior in a matter of seconds. I felt a little nervous as I took in the baleful snarl on his face. Should I not have been so stern? "It's okay, buddy," I whispered, my voice a little unsteady now, not knowing how he'd react. He growled threateningly as his eyes hardened and he began nipping at the air, his teeth gnashing awkwardly, sending a tingling sensation crawling down my spine. Jesus fuck. What was the reason behind this sudden transformation? The dog almost looked rabid at this point. It suddenly dawned on me that I was all alone here. If he decided to attack me, which seemed to be a certainty now, I'd have to fight him off all by myself. I wanted to defuse the situation, but he didn't look like he wanted to do anything other than to attack me. He lunged at me, snapping his teeth dangerously, and I brought my foot up to push his face away, taking care not to hit him. But with the way he was looking at me, I doubt my restraint would last, not if I wanted to avoid getting bitten. He came at me again, this time wrapping his teeth around my shoe and biting with all his might. I quickly swung my leg and he jumped away to safety before charging at me again, fangs bared, ready to sink his canines into my flesh. I kicked at his head, more out of desperation than a desire to hurt the animal. But he was far too nimble, easy dodging my attack and pouncing on me again, and again, and again. He circled me like a predator, eyes sharp, growling menacingly. There was actual malice on his face. He didn't just look like your average angry mutt. There was something much more vicious going on here. Sweat gushed down my brow and stained my pits as my heart began pounding so hard in my chest I feared it would burst out any second. This had turned into a very dangerous situation, and my fight and flight instinct was kicking in hard. He leapt at me one more time, but this time I connected. It was a solid blow, hard enough to daze him and make him whine. I took full advantage of that and took off running, not looking behind me even once. But I could feel him hot on my heels, his breath warming the back of my knees, teeth always inches from tearing off chunks of my flesh. I pumped my arms and legs as I ran, fear and adrenaline pushing me past my limits. Down the incline of the hillock, past the towering pine trees, over the little wooden bridge, I ran and ran and ran, and the fucking dog kept pace with me. It felt like he was playing with me, for he could have caught me a long time ago, despite my years of running experience. But he didn't. Was he wearing me down? I was starting to run out of breath, and as his teeth scraped my shin I knew I was going to run out of time soon enough regardless. Salvation came in the form of voices just up ahead. With renewed vigor, I picked up speed once again even as my lungs threatened to explode in my chest. The dog trailed off when people started becoming more than just tiny dots in the distance, and he soon disappeared into the foliage, leaving me a wheezing, shivering mess. Really? A little puppy traumatized you this much? My wife asked, her eyes twinkling with mirth. I pulled up my pants and began applying the cream to my leg that was now white all over with scratches and bites, none of which had thankfully drawn blood. You should have seen him, Amy, I replied, still feeling a little unsettled. It's not just that he was fucking big, but, I don't know, there was just something wrong with him, you know? The way he became so aggressive so suddenly, how persistent he was. Just, you sure you don't want to go to the hospital? She asked, her voice full of genuine concern now. I shook my head. It's fine. Really? You really should, she said firmly. Okay. I relented. I'll swing by after I get off work. Want me to kiss it and make it better in the meantime? I would really, really like that. By the time I made it back home that evening, I had mostly put that morning's incident aside, rationalizing it as just an oddity, even though I was a little apprehensive about running into that dog the next morning. Thankfully, I didn't have to get rabies shots, and since I was already up to date with my tetanus vaccine, my visit to the doctors had been relatively short. I turned in early that night. Work had been especially tiring. At first, I didn't understand what exactly had woken me up in the middle of the night. I blinked my eyes open and noticed the soft beams of moonlight passing through the arched glass windows, forming hypnotic whitish shimmering strips on the hardwood floor. A mournful howl reached my ears, jolting me to alertness. Goosebumps formed on my arms as I instantly understood what was making that sound.
No.
No freaking way. I sprang out of bed, pushing the quilt aside and scrambled for the windows. I drew the curtains aside and peered outside. Our house was located on a quaint little cul-de-sac, right where the road loops around, giving me a wide view of the neighborhood. Out there, beneath a flickering streetlight that intermittently swept aside the darkness, was the dog, sitting patiently and howling to his heart's content. My heart started racing. What in the world was he doing here? He stopped, swung his head around, and began staring at me hatefully. I don't know how, but he knew it was me standing here at the window looking at him. I shuddered as I met his malicious, piercing gaze, feeling more naked and exposed than I've ever had. He snarled and began slowly walking towards me, fangs bared, ready to pounce. It was so bizarrely terrifying. Why was he here? What did he want? Amy, I whispered, my voice so fearfully low even I couldn't hear it. I gulped and cleared my throat. Amy. What? She groaned, and the sheets rustled as she began to yawn. It's him, I said, the curtains shaking as my hands trembled. The dog. He's here. Ugh. Go back to sleep, baby. Get off my fucking lawn, you mutt. Came the voice of Mr. Kowalski from his house, lying to the left of where the dog was. Something crashed against the trash can in front of the house, making a loud booming sound. Out! My neighbor screamed again. The dog stopped, turned to his right, hackles raised, chest rumbling slightly, and darted towards Mr. Kowalski's house, disappearing from the short reach of the streetlight before I could so much as blink. The screaming started almost immediately. This heart-wrenching, soul-crushing screeching that sounded like someone's death throes. I felt fear, no, sheer primal terror coil around my chest, making it difficult to breathe. Oh my God, what was that? I jumped, the fear nearly making me yelp. I turned my head and looked at Annie, sitting up, fully alert with her eyes wide open. Call 911, I said, as I reached for my phone. What's happening? Just do it. I grabbed my ball bat and went bounding down the stairs, jumping over 2 steps at a time, pure adrenaline pumping me forward. I was already out the door and sprinting towards Mr. Kowalski's house before I could even begin to contemplate just how stupid it was to bum rush this. Other neighbors were groggily coming out of their homes, wondering what the fuck was happening in this quiet neighborhood at 1 a.m. on a weekday. Call 911, I screamed while pointing at them. Mr. Kowalski's house. I didn't wait for their reactions and ran up Mr. Kowalski's yard, the short, dewy grass tickling my slipper-clad feet, and entered through the door that had been left ajar. I stopped and started groping around for the light switch, but soon gave up and pulled out my phone, using its flashlight to illuminate the way. I hadn't even taken a couple of steps into the house when I heard a clattering sound and something flew past me, rubbing against my legs and making me drop my phone. I turned and saw a dog skittering off into the darkness. The most frightening thing about this was that the dog I just saw wasn't the one that had attacked me this morning and had just charged into this house moments ago. And Mr. Kowalski didn't have a dog either. What the fuck was going on here? I picked my phone up off the ground and swung it around, the light it emitted vibrating in the air as my hands shook in fear, before falling on a corpse splayed out on a coffee table in the center of the living room. His throat was ripped off, and the oodles of blood that had gushed out of his body had stained the table, before pooling on the hardwood floor below, and now glowing under the light from my phone. It was the dog that had been scaring the living daylights out of me since this morning, his brown fur now looking lifeless and carrying splotches of dark, coagulated red blood. Mr. Kowalski's walking stick was lying on the floor beneath the corpse, forsaken by its missing owner. I was horrified and beyond confused at this point. Why was this dog dead? Who was the dog that just ran out of this house? Also, the owner of the house was nowhere to be seen. My brain was working overtime, trying to solve this puzzle, to figure out what the fuck was going on, when loud screaming brought me back to reality. My heart almost jumped out of my mouth when I recognized Amy's voice. Before I realized what was happening, my feet were moving and I was running back to my house, shoving past some people who were coming to the crime scene to investigate, while praying that my wife was all right. The smell of death rushed down the wooden staircase and assaulted my nostrils as I entered my house.
No. No. No.
Please, no. I started climbing the stairs, slowly because I feared what was waiting for me up there. Halfway up I heard noises that made one retch, to run far away from this place. Crunch, squish. Bones were being shattered. Flesh was being chewed on. Blood was dripping on the floor. My brain was going into overdrive, conjuring up horrific images that were threatening to drag me down into the void of insanity. I clutched my bat tighter and plodded on, trying hard to stamp out the images from my mind. I heard something shuffling around, making scratching noises as its clawed paws rubbed against the hard floor. I stopped outside my bedroom, the source of the sounds which sounded so painfully loud from here. After taking a deep breath, I walked in, using the phone to light up the room. What I saw there wasn't what I was expecting, not even close to it, and will continue to haunt me till the day I'm lowered into my grave, maybe even beyond it. The dog that had run out of Mr. Kowalski's house was lying dead on the floor of my bedroom, its throat ripped out, and my wife was hunched over his corpse. Amy, I whispered as I shone the light on her. Crunch, squish, crack. The sounds rang loudly in the quiet room, bouncing around on the walls before harshly invading my ears. It was Amy. She was biting the dead dog's flesh and eating it, her gnarly-looking hands now sprouting vicious little claws as clumps of hair fell out of her fast, balding head. Her arms were pockmarked with puncture wounds, scars of the short battle she'd fought with the dog who was now laid out like a scrumptious meal in front of her. The dog may have died, but I had a sinking feeling it had gotten what it had really wanted. I grunted involuntarily at the repulsive sight in front of me. Her head shot up at my voice, then was cocked to the right. She saw me, fur and flesh hanging from her mouth, and growled. Fifth story. The Harrison Lake Incident. I grew up in a small town in Idaho. Like any other small town, partying was the only thing for younger people like myself to do on the weekends. Most of the time, all of my friends and I would meet up and head out to some remote location so that we could drink beer and smoke weed without our parents bothering us. That tradition would change forever after one cold fall night in 2005. We all met up that Friday night at the local gas station to stock up on beer and cigarettes before heading out to the desert. It was one of those creepy sort of nights. The trees had just finished shedding most of their leaves, and the bare branches slightly swaying with the wind made me uneasy. Those kinds of things always freaked me out. I remember telling myself to stop being such a pussy. Nothing bad had ever happened to any of us while we were out in that desert, so I knew that there was nothing to worry about, but regardless, I still couldn't shake this uneasy feeling that I had that night. Something just didn't feel right. I have since learned to trust my feelings when it comes to these types of things, but I certainly did not take those gut instincts into account that night. Our normal party spot was about 20 miles west of town. We would take the highway and then turn off on a small dirt road. We would follow that road until we came to a little canyon. Most of the area was relatively flat, so this little canyon made the perfect place to start a fire without anyone being able to see it from the highway. We started a bonfire with pallets as usual and sat around the fire drinking and talking. Several hours had passed and many people were starting to head home. It was around 2 o'clock in the morning. My friend Sarah and I weren't ready to head home for the night, so we decided to take a little drive out to Harrison Lake. The lake was about 10 miles further down the highway. It was a small body of water that wasn't good for anything other than catching the occasional small fish and swimming with the girls in the summertime. It was also a good place to park and talk. As we approached the small country road that led to the lake, I couldn't help but notice that someone else was already there. I saw the dim, flickering light of a campfire near the parking area. This was somewhat unusual because this place was normally deserted this time of year. I decided to keep heading down to the lake anyway, thinking that I probably knew the people. When I pulled up to the parking area, the fire was about 20 feet off the road in a small field. I immediately noticed that something wasn't right. There were 6 people standing in a circle around the fire. They were all wearing black robes with hoods covering their heads and obscuring their faces. There was a large pole coming directly up out of the fire pit, sticking about 10 feet up in the air with some sort of animal impaled on the top of it. It looked like a cat, but I wasn't quite sure at the time. When Sarah saw this, she immediately grabbed my arm and said something along the lines of, "Holy shit, get us the fuck out of here." I agreed, but I couldn't leave without saying something to these freaks about the animal they were obviously torturing. I rolled down my window and immediately heard some kind of creepy chanting, like they were all praying in some sort of fucked up, satanic worshipping way. It sounded like a form of Latin, but I wasn't quite sure. I looked directly at all 6 of them and yelled out my window, "We are going to report all of you freaks to the cops for torturing that goddamn cat." That was a mistake that I will regret for the rest of my entire life. One of the robed freaks immediately snapped its head in our direction and made the most god-awful growling noise. It sounded like a combination of a lion's roar and an old lady screaming. I immediately felt the hair on the back of my neck stand straight up. I slammed the car into drive and took off as fast as I could. At the same time, I saw this person or creature, whatever the hell it was, throw off its robe and go down onto all 4s. It bolted down the road after us. I could see the moonlight shining off of its body in my rearview mirror as I sped down the road toward the highway. It looked like some sort of half-man, half-werewolf. This thing ran faster than anything I had ever seen. In about 10 seconds, it was running next to my window as I sped down the road. I was probably going at least 50 miles per hour, and this thing had no problem keeping up with me. It looked over at me and screamed, "You're ours now. You will never escape us," in the most awful-sounding voice that I have ever heard. It had no face, just 2 red glowing eyes and blackness. I floored the pedal and was able to finally pull away from this thing. We made it to the highway, and I didn't see anything behind us after that. The entire ride home was unbelievably uncomfortable. We were fucking freaked out beyond belief. Sarah asked me if I would stay at her house that night because her parents were out of town and she didn't want to be alone. I agreed 100%. I didn't want to drive home alone anyway after seeing what I saw at the lake. After about 15 minutes of very fast driving, I thought that we were probably in the clear by now. No one was following us, and we were almost to Sarah's house. I had no clue that the nightmare we were experiencing was just beginning. We still had a long, terrifying night ahead of us. Thanks a lot for watching the video till the end. Subscribe to our channel Horror in Detail. Drop your opinions/suggestions in the comments section, and like the video as it helps with the YouTube algorithm.